Okay, all right. So let's go ahead and share the screen here, and let's go ahead and continue with our discussion here in chapter one. Okay, so like I said, we finished off with the with the Texas history, and we definitely needed to cover the history of Texas as it relates to Texas as a democracy, because as I was mentioning right now, that Texas's rich, unique history. Uh, does go hand in hand with a lot of the uh, political culture that we see here in Texas, right? The unique political culture. And so, what we're going to do here today is we're going to take a look at some key terms regarding democracy and then tie this in to the overall political culture of Texas. And we're going to be able to determine uh, which of the three major examples of political culture does Texas tend to demonstrate. So I'll give you all some examples, of course, and we'll definitely discuss this here. So again, I apologize if I'm not the best when it comes to, like I said, I'm not feeling all too well today, but we should be able to get through this. So okay, so anyway, so Texas has a democracy. So democracy, of course, and for those of you who have taken federal government already, I'm sure you're familiar with some of these concepts of political theory. Uh, Democracy, of course, is defined as the form of government based on the theory that the legitimacy of any government must come from the free participation of its citizens. So, obviously, of course, a democracy, uh, as you all learned in Government 2305, is a system of government in which the people are the ones who play the most important role, the most vital role within the system of government. Because without the people, without the free participation of the citizens, a democracy is not going to be able to function, or it might function, but not in its most optimal level. You definitely want to have a democracy, definitely requires for people to be able to um, participate as much as possible, to be able to be informed, to be informed of what's going on in their government, be involved in their government. All of this is extremely important in order to foster a democracy that operates at its optimal level, where you have people knowing about the issues, being informed about what's going on, and making rational decisions through their votes, and ultimately selecting their leaders, not necessarily based on like popularity contests or but more so about the policies that these candidates are putting forth, and whether the citizens agree or disagree. Right, then it becomes simply a matter of what does the public in general, what are they favoring? Do they favor candidate what candidate A stands for, or what candidate B stands for? Right. In a functioning democracy, this is what we tend to see. And of course, there's also this idea of legitimacy, right? The people's belief that their government is morally just and that they are therefore obligated to obey its laws. And this goes back to, John Locke and social contract theory, this idea that, we're willing to give up, some of our rights, this idea that we can't just do whatever we want to, right? We're willing to give up some of those things that we might want to do, some of those things that people might want to do, but we give up some of those to help the greater good, the morally just, as it's saying here, to allow for government to be able to pursue these important responsibilities that benefit all of us, right? So of course, great examples would be like we're willing to give up not being able to drive as fast as we'd like, having to stop at so that of course involves putting speed limits, traffic signs, stop signs, traffic lights, and all that. Even though we might not like those, we might find them annoying. We understand the importance of them so that we could try to create a a road system that is nowhere near as chaotic as it would be if we didn't have any of these types of restrictions put in place. And so when we accept that, because we believe that people's safety is more important than just driving however you want to, right? So those are examples of the social contract theories, and we've seen this in other aspects as well. Like we've seen this recently, with what was happening with the start of the pandemic and public health emergencies, things like that. But of course, that can only go so far because, of course, obviously, if the public does not feel that the issue or the responses are legitimate, that's going to cause some issues, as we saw throughout the pandemic. We did see issues with legitimacy, and it's something we still see to this day. Um, in terms of how some people, view, the entire issue. And, I'm sure you all know exactly what I'm talking about in terms of, vaccines and all that stuff. There's still a lot of that vaccine hesitancy because of the lack of legitimacy that people might have for the government. Private influence over public policy. So again, a fully functioning democracy definitely tries to view both of these and tries to balance them out in the most logical and most effective way possible, because and the United States tends to gravitate towards this balancing of not having too much public policy that becomes overbearing against the private sector, but then you also don't want the private sector influencing too much into the public policy. You want to try to find that sweet spot where both of these entities try to act in mutually beneficial ways, right? Because you definitely do want to have a vibrant private sector that allows for people to be able to go into business for themselves, be successful, and ultimately achieve that American dream of success. But at the same time, you also don't want for the private sector to be dominating everything, right? You definitely also want some government regulations to be put in place, for safety, like I mentioned. I mean, we can think of other examples like the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, that ensures that the food that we eat is relatively safe, and then of course putting all that information out there on the label, so that way we can make informed choices about what we're eating. And so you definitely want to have that balancing act where you want to have both of these, these play a part. But unfortunately, in some of these democracies, we do see more of a private influence over public policy. We'll get to when we get to the interest group chapter. We'll talk about lobbying. We'll talk about how that some of these organizations, some of these interest groups and organizations can be very powerful because of the money they have and the amount of money that they can use, to hire lobbyists and get for government officials to either support what the interest groups are wanting to pursue or to not support what the interest groups are in favor of, right? To go against, to agree with the interest groups going against certain policies, right? So, and we'll take a look at how in Texas government, especially in the Texas legislature, that lobbying is an even greater influencing force than even at the national level, which that says something, because even at the national level, there's still lots of lobbying power, but even more so in state governments here, which we'll talk about when we get to the lobbying chapter here. Okay. Okay. So let's see. Let's just kind of run through this really quickly. The evaluating democracy, that the qualities of a well-run democracy, and that politicians debate questions of public policy honestly, and that they are straightforward. They tell it like it is. They're not lying. They're not that they're not engaging in logical fallacies when they argue or they debate, that they're very, like I said, straightforward. They're not engaging in these maybe like misinformation type of aspects. Everything's just very straight up when it comes to the discussions. And so the debates are about policy, right, where they're having fundamental disagreements about policy between the candidates. Media reports debate in a fair manner, right? So again, the media reporting also should be straightforward in a run democracy. And that's not to say that there aren't biases in the media. It's just that in today's democracy, the biases are very, very noticeable, more so than even 20-something years ago, when some of these 24/7 cable news networks were starting to become very powerful, like Fox News and then CNN as well. Now the debates tend to be very opinionated, and we'll definitely talk about that here later on. People pay attention to the debate, right? They pay attention to the words and what's actually being said in terms of policies, not tuning in for the drama or the chisme or anything like that. You know what I mean? Like, just actually wanting to listen to the debate and be interested in the debate for that reason, for public policy reasons. People vote their preferences consistently with their understanding of public interest, right? That the debates are essential to ultimately make an informed decision about who you're going to support in these upcoming elections based on what the candidates say in the debates, right? And of course, you also do your homework and your research by looking up your public interests and being informed about what's going on in government, and then that also influences how you're going to decide, right? And the government decisions are made on the basis of law without it having any unearned advantage, right? The incumbent, of course, is always going to have some sort of advantage because they are in the current position and they can say that they've done this, and this, whereas the challenger is, can really only speak in hypotheticals type of thing, right? For the most part, you might have some like if Trump becomes the nominee, coming up in the 2024 election, you'll have a situation where you've got a former president, debating against a current president, and so that could be something interesting where both of them would definitely have the advantage of doing the job, and then it's just basically up to you in terms of, I guess, which of them you prefer best in terms of the job that they do. But when we look at this evaluation aspect, it asks you to kind of do like a Likert scale. So basically asks you to kind of sum this up, not just in Texas, but I guess, we could also talk about this within American democracy, right? Because I don't think that I don't think that it is a secret that both Texas and the United States in general kind of fall a little bit short on this, right? I mean, if you've seen some of the recent debates, you'll see that yeah, they talk about policy, but that's not the exciting thing about it. It's about the drama, right, and how these two people are going to react to each other, right? I know, like in 2016, like a lot of people were tuning in to see what Trump was going to say about Hillary and this and that, and then in 2020 we also had some, we also had some, some of this as well between Trump and Biden, because Trump tends to be very bombastic with the way he says things, right? Very in your face, very direct, and definitely, and a lot of people like that style, right? A lot of people like that style of being direct and not, kind of going after the person type of thing, But when we look at a well-run democracy, though, regardless of whether people like that style or not, unfortunately, it does cause a situation where, because they're not talking about policy and they're talking mostly about their personal issues and the personal differences, while yes, it becomes more exciting, you could say, because unfortunately policy can sometimes not be the most exciting thing in the world. But does it actually generate, does it actually generate public policy discussions, or is it more so just who people liked from the debate in terms of how they acted and how they were? And again, and this is even before Trump, because if you go back to like the Kennedy Nixon debates in the 1960s, while those debates were very much about policy, research has of course been shown that because JFK was, he was very vibrant, and then Nixon of course was sick that night, so he looked, he hadn't even really shaved, so it was the first debate on television, right? The first presidential debate. So it definitely created a situation where, because Kennedy looked the part more so than Nixon, this helped him out. And of course Nixon had an advantage of being the current vice president at the time. He was the vice president under Eisenhower. So, but again, these are just things to think about in terms of what a well-run democracy should look like. And unfortunately, we do have some work to do, in terms of how we are, not just in Texas but also in the United States as well. Okay, so let's talk about the federal system here real quickly. So federal system, of course, is a system of government that provides for a division and sharing of powers between the national government and state or regional governments. Now, again, this is another important concept from federal government, right? This is the idea that the federal government is not in control of everything. That power amongst our governments, and when I say that, I mean all the different levels of government, that the power is not just consolidated in the national government, right? The federal government does not control everything. Joe Biden does not tell Greg Abbott what to do, right? Because President Biden is only in charge of the federal executive branch. He also can't even tell, Kevin McCarthy, the current House Speaker, what to do, because he is in a different branch within the federal government. So even within the federal government, there is no total control even within the federal government, right? Because you have the separation of powers and the checks and balances, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But how this relates to Texas here is that in a federal system, the federal government has their own unique responsibilities, and the state and regional governments have their own unique responsibilities. Now, we don't see this as much as back in the 1800s, where you had what was called dual federalism, where you had that strict divide between the federal government and the state governments, and they pretty much kept their distance. Nowadays, we have what's called cooperative federalism, and we'll go over this more so later on. Cooperative federalism, of course, I believe we go over it a little bit later on in the course, right? So cooperative federalism is more so where the federal and the state governments cooperate with each other to reach common goals. And we see this a lot, especially when it comes to, because the federal government has so much more money than the states, because while the states have to maintain a balanced budget, the federal government does not. They can operate under, they've got a debt that they can operate under. states cannot operate on a debt because they do not have the ability to coin money like the federal government does. So because of this, the federal government is able to really influence how states operate because of the money that they can provide to these states, because some of these states usually rely on a lot of federal dollars in order to get their budgets to, to make it through the, through the fiscal year. Texas definitely incorporates a lot of federal money into their own state budgets, because without that federal money, it would be difficult to really be able to run the state. So the state does use a lot of federal dollars, especially when it comes to like some of these programs that are sponsored by the federal government, but the states administer them, like the Medicaid program, the SNAP program, or called food stamps, which we'll talk about that later on in this class. But just keep in mind that this idea of federalism is where you don't have the federal government calling all the shots on everything, and you don't have the state governments doing all that, right? Also keep in mind that with the 10th Amendment, this is what gives the states power for responsibilities that are not mentioned in the Constitution, right? Such as education, the criminal code. These are powers that are belonging to the state governments, particularly in education, right? Because education is not mentioned in the Constitution, because back when the Constitution was written, education was a private affair, right? You had private schools, right? This is why the vast majority of people were not educated, because we did not have public education. Being educated was a privilege, right? And this is why a lot of the framers were educated, because they were very well off. But nowadays, of course, now we've expanded educational opportunities to everyone, right? Through K through 12 public education. And of course, even in higher education, we do have a lot of government assistance, with financial aid and all that. So the government is heavily involved within education. But again, it's mostly a state requirement. That's why teachers they work for school districts that are overseen by the state agencies, like the Texas Education Agency. In order to get certified as a teacher, you have to get approved by the State Board of Education, which we'll talk about all that later on when we get to education here in Texas. But just keep that in mind in terms of what a federal system is, right? That the federal government has their unique responsibilities, states also have theirs, and also local government also has unique responsibilities as well, which we'll talk more about when we get to the local government chapter. Okay. So this is talking about in terms of should Texas have a foreign policy. So again, do keep this in mind that this is a very interesting issue, as we've discussed before, that because Texas shares an international boundary with Mexico, the issue about immigration and border security is a very contentious issue, especially with states that share an international border. Now, of course, as we've mentioned before, right? Because it talks about here that when we're looking at the responsibility of which level of government is responsible for immigration and border security, that responsibility falls on the federal government, because in Article 1, Section 8 of our U.S. Constitution, which is basically Congress's job description, because it discusses the duties and responsibilities that Congress has, there is one section where it talks about rule of naturalization, which is basically, we call that immigration now. But rule of naturalization is, what we would call immigration today. So that is what gives Congress the authority to pass immigration law. And that is what gives the executive branch under the presidency and Department of Homeland Security, which then you get Border Patrol, ICE, CBP, so Immigration, Customs Enforcement, Customs Border Protection. So all of those federal agencies that work under the executive branch under Homeland Security, they have that authority to enforce immigration law, to also provide for border security. This is why the federal government takes the lead when it comes to securing the border, right? That's why you have federal agents. The Border Patrol is a federal agency. The federal agents are supposed to secure the border and patrol it, because that is a federal responsibility. However, though, what if the state of Texas does not agree with the job that the federal government is doing? What if the state of Texas feels that the Border Patrol might not be getting the job done? And the issue then is that if, let's say, the state of Texas does not quite agree with the job that the federal government is doing in regards to the border, then that creates a situation where, yes, people might be crossing over into the United States, but they're not just crossing into the United States, right? They're also crossing into the state of Texas. And if they cross here locally, they're crossing into Hidalgo County, and they might even get into the city of Mission jurisdiction, right? If they're crossing near on Zaldúa. So you see how that it's not even though technically the federal government is the one who makes the final call and is supposed to be responsible, this is why the state of Texas and Governor Greg Abbott has been very vocal about this. He's been very hands-on about this. This is why he has authorized for DPS, Texas Department of Public Safety, the state police officers, to go and help with border security, right? And for the most part, they usually tend to work well together because, one thing that I've noticed about law enforcement, which I wish our federal and state elected officials would be able to do this, is that law enforcement officials usually work together very well between different agencies. I wish that our governments would also work just as well. So that proves that government can work together. It's just that the people at the top, I guess, kind of maybe they don't they haven't been able to work as closely as some of the law enforcement agents. But my point is that it can be done. So usually the law enforcement agencies are able to work together, but that doesn't mean that they don't agree all the time, right? I mean, we saw what happened with Uvalde, right? That's an example of where because you had all the agencies, right? You had DPS, you had Border Patrol, you had City of Uvalde police, and even the district police, right? And they weren't able to, unfortunately, and the reason why is because the incident commander, who was the chief of the school district police, you probably heard, right, that there was disagreement on what to do, but in an emergency, there's supposed to be there is supposed to be an incident command leader, and I know this because I've done some FEMA training on this. There's supposed to be an incident command leader that takes the lead on this, and so I guess they're still trying to investigate what happened, so to speak. Why did it take so long for them to ultimately enter the building? And it was a Border Patrol agent that ultimately took down the gunman. But for the most part, usually the different law enforcement agencies are able to work together. But again, the reason why I bring this up is because I want for us to, and of course, there's also the pros and cons here in terms of should Texas be involved in the international arena, especially considering that they share a border with Mexico, and they and obviously Texas benefits from the trade, right? Especially down here in the valley, we definitely benefit from that trade. Especially with NAFTA, right? When after NAFTA was passed in the early '90s under the Clinton administration, it's not a coincidence that since then the valley has just taken off in growth when it comes to. I mean, you all probably have seen it, right? I mean, I like to say I vividly remember when Ware and the expressway was just an open field. Like now everything is there. So it's just insane how much it's grown, how much the valley has grown in the last 20 something years. And we'll talk about that, how that also has some effects, some consequence with the property taxes going up. But yes, so all of this, of course, is predicated on this notion that Texas has a close relationship with Mexico economically, but there are some issues when it comes to the immigration, right? And of course, so we've seen so some of these cons as well. It talks about the some of the issues with the Constitution, in terms of states engaging with foreign entities and things like that. But again, but the point that I want for y'all to understand is that it's a complicated situation, right? That yes, the federal government technically is supposed to take the lead on international affairs, but Texas certainly also has a right to get involved in whatever way that they can, especially if they feel that their citizens are at risk. So again, it's a complicated situation. I don't have all the answers for it, but it's definitely something for y'all to think about and for y'all to make your own determinations on how you see Texas fitting into the international arena. Okay, now let's get to what I feel is probably the most important aspect of this chapter here, which is the actual political culture examples themselves. Okay, so Texas in the political culture. Now, political culture itself is defined as a shared framework of values, beliefs, and habits of behavior with regard to government and politics within which a particular political system functions. Okay, so in a nutshell, what political culture means is what are the ideas of society within and when we're talking about a political system, we're talking about like a government. We're talking about an entity, right? Whether it's the national government, a state itself, a city, a county, a community. All of these places are going to have unique political cultures that reflect the ideas and values of the people that live there, right? And some examples of this, of course, are, some key questions like, what should government be involved in? Should they be involved in these certain types of areas? What we were talking about right now with the border security, that's an example of political culture, right? Because we're discussing, should Texas get involved? Does Texas have a right to get involved with their international border with Mexico, even though technically the federal government is supposed to take the lead on that? Those are examples of political culture, and how people feel about those issues is reflected based on a lot of different factors, whether it's their own upbringing, um, where they've lived and who they interact with. That's why political socialization, which we'll talk about when we get to the liberal versus conservative chapter. That's something that's very personal for people, right? People's political culture is very personal, just like everyone's culture is personal, right? Um, every time I teach a class, I always look for the culture of the classroom, right? Because every class has its own culture, it has its own uh, community, its way of doing things, the way it interacts. Every class has its own unique culture. Some classes are a little bit more chill and not as engaged, but then some of the classes are very engaged and they want to ask a lot of questions and they want to learn more about this material. And there's nothing wrong with either one. It's just that every class is going to be different, right? You're going to have your extroverts, your introverts, and some of them have more than others. So it is what it is. But with that being said, in terms of political culture, we're going to take a look at these three examples, and we're going to determine which of these three does Texas tend to ascribe to for the most part. Now, the first one you don't really see too much in Texas, except maybe like in the Austin area. This is your more liberal, progressive political culture, the moralistic political culture. This culture, which is dominant in the northern tier of American states, especially along the Northeast, so states like New York, Boston, the very progressive liberal parts of the country, moving over towards, some of the upper Midwest like Minnesota. They also tend to be very progressive, because of the Canadian influence. And then moving on off from the West Coast, you got California, Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii. They call it the left coast. That's kind of, something that, that's kind of a somewhat of a pejorative term, but maybe not. So that, obviously those areas also tend to be, pretty progressive and liberal, right? So they ascribe to the moralistic political culture in which citizens understand the state and the nation as commonwealths designed to further the shared interests of everyone. Citizen participation is a widely shared value, and governmental activism on behalf of the common good is encouraged. Now, I have another personal story from when I was in New York. So I was, after I took they had a bus to take me to Times Square from the airport, and then I had to walk a little bit through Times Square to get to my hotel, because my hotel was actually in Times Square, the nicest hotel I've ever been in. Very, very expensive. It's the Marriott there, but very, very nice. The fastest elevator I've ever been in my life. It was like insanely fast. But with that being said, so as I was walking in Times Square, and I don't know why I heard this, but because there was a bunch of people walking, I was trying to get to my hotel. But the very first thing I clearly heard when I was walking in Times Square amongst all these people in New York, somebody said, I swear, this is what they said. They said, if you are not a liberal, you do not have a heart. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, okay, I'm definitely not in Texas anymore. Like, this is definitely not the Lone Star State that I'm in. That's when I finally felt like, okay, I wasn't in Texas, So that encapsulated the moralistic political culture, because for a lot of these people in these areas of the United States, they feel that being a liberal is moralistic, right? That it is moralistic to want to care for your fellow person, that you want to, and not just caring, but also getting involved politically to try to push forth certain policies that will benefit, the common good, right? And so this is why in these northern, more liberal states, you're going to see a lot more spending for some of these social programs, like the SNAP program, Medicaid, and things like that. You're going to chip money. So you're going to see a lot more of those programs being funded more in some of these moralistic states, because they feel that that is part of the common good, right? And so citizen act participation is, and it's designed, like we said, to further the shared interests of everyone, right? It's not just about every person for themselves. It's about the collective good of the society, of the group, right? That we try to bring people up, within the group, because if everyone is up here at the top, then we all benefit. Citizen participation is a widely shared value. This is why these states tend to have the highest voter turnout rates. I know Minnesota usually always leads the nation in terms of voter turnout rates, whereas Texas usually is almost at the bottom, which we'll talk about right here later on. So I think it's clear to say that Texas is not moralistic, except for maybe the Austin area. That that area has gotten to be pretty liberal for a lot of different reasons. Not just the Californians that are moving over there, but also the area itself has always tended, as for the most part, has usually tended to be rather liberal and moralistic. So there usually is that correlation between liberalism and moralistic political culture. Okay, let's go to individualistic political culture. This culture historically dominant in the middle tier of American states. So this is more like your Great Plains. This is, like your Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Wyoming, Utah, Montana, Idaho, those types of areas of the country. The Great Plains, and then moving over to the northern Rocky Mountain ranges here, and even in some state, even in portions of some states like Western Washington and Western Oregon. This is where you tend to see most of this, right? Because even though, I mentioned about those states as being part of the left coast, but the areas that are closer to like Idaho and Montana, those tend to be really conservative. Like I know, like Washington State, yes, Seattle is pretty liberal and progressive, but Spokane, which is where Gonzaga's at, on the close to on the other side of the state, that area tends to be rather conservative. So even within states, you see liberal and conservative areas there. But anyway, let's get back to the individualistic culture. So this culture, historically dominant, like we said, in the middle tier of the American states, in which citizens understand the state and nation as marketplaces in which people strive to better their personal welfare. Citizen participation is encouraged as a means of individual achievement, and government activity is encouraged when it attempts to create private opportunity and discouraged when it attempts to redistribute wealth. So going back, let me just take a drink of water really quickly here. So going back to, kind of comparing individualistic to moralistic, right? That this is kind of like the polar opposite, right? That in individualistic political cultures, it's not about, the common good. It's more about the individual, right? I think that makes a lot of sense. It defines itself, right? But some examples of how we see individualism, really, and this also as a whole is what America usually tends to be, at least at some basic level. We tend to be more so on the individualistic side as a whole, as opposed to moralistic, because America, of course, has a lot of this previous historical culture influenced by the Puritans and the Protestant work ethic, that people need to work in order to be successful, that people can't just get something for free, right? I mean, I'm sure you've heard of some of this phraseology before, right? And of course, this is also why capitalism usually tends to go hand in hand with our own political culture, because capitalism, encourages, individual achievement and being able to rise above these things through your hard work and your innovation and to study, right? I mean, you all are great examples of that, as we all are taking these college classes to want to move up in life, right? So again, this idea that the state and nation are these marketplaces, right? Where people, just like any marketplace, right? You're going to have winners and losers. You're going to have, better deals, and then people are going to try to make informed decisions as best as they can to improve that personal wealth, so that, their welfare. That way, the people who will strive to be successful, they'll do so through their perseverance and their innovation. And citizen participation is encouraged to ensure that people's individual achievements remain steady, right? So this is why someone in an individualistic political culture, let's say, they tend to be rather wealthy, right? Or they tend to be upper middle class. They might tend to vote against higher taxes because they're the ones who are going to feel, the effect of that, right? They're going to feel the brunt of that, because the more money you make, the more you're going to pay in taxes. And so they might want to keep some more of their hard-earned money, because, they don't want to just give it away to Uncle Sam, right? So they want to try to, maybe they'll vote more in their own self-interest as opposed to the group. And again, and they do encourage private opportunity again, but they also are suspicious of wealth being redistributed, right? Like I said, higher taxes, individualistic political culture tends to frown on higher taxes, whereas in moralistic political culture, they tend to have higher taxes because the moralistic, they believe that benefits the common good. That's why places like California and New York, they definitely do tend to have some of the highest taxes in the country here. Although Texas with the property taxes also tends to be pretty high as well, which we'll talk about that later on here. And then lastly, traditionalistic political culture. This is the culture historically dominant in the southern tier of American states. So this isn't just Texas, but this is also like your Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, although Georgia's kind of shifting a little bit. These tend to be the areas where you see traditionalistic political culture. So they rely on tradition, okay? So in this culture, citizens technically believe in democracy, but do not encourage participation. And government actively is generally viewed with suspicion unless its purpose is to reinforce the power of elites. So traditionalistic is it's kind of like an even more extreme version of individualistic, where the individual is also valued, but more so the elite individualists, right? This is why in traditionalistic political culture, you tend to see a lot of reverence for, some of these rich people, like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg around. There tends to be a lot of reverence, especially with Elon Musk. You've probably seen that he gets a lot of he gets a lot of praise, right, from a lot of different people. A lot of people admire him. So this tends to go to this idea of traditionalistic political culture, that we want to, let's let Elon do what he's doing because he's obviously been successful, so he knows what he's doing. So let's kind of let him kind of take the lead on economic decisions because he's been successful, and that's kind of the idea, right? Is that, hey, these people are elite for a reason, right? These people are rich for a reason, so we're going to kind of cater to what they're believing and what they're wanting to do because they've demonstrated that they can be that they're successful. And so this is why traditionalistic political culture tends to not encourage participation, because they tend to want to gravitate towards the elites here, like I'm mentioning. So with all this being said, where does Texas lie on? Definitely, of course, on the traditionalistic, but also some aspects of individualism as well, right? So you could probably make an argument that Texas is a traditionalistic / individualistic political culture. And I usually go with traditionalistic first because I do believe Texas is a little bit more traditionalistic than individualistic. But again, both of these are not mutually exclusive. You can be both of these, but for sure Texas is not this one. At least not in most Texas. In Austin, yes, but but probably that's but for the most part, Texas tends to be individualistic and traditionalistic. So again, this is the most important aspect of this chapter that I wanted for us to focus on. And again, this gives some more examples here in terms of the political cultures and how they view about certain aspects such as participation, the ideas of political parties, and joining up with them, government activity. Because going back to this last part here is that traditionalistic political culture tends to be very suspicious of government. They tend to not like, they tend to only want to give government as little power as necessary, right? Just give government the bare minimum. Anything else that government wants to get involved in, we should not let them, because government does not need to be getting involved, right? Because in traditionalistic political culture, government is not to be trusted. Government is more a problem than the solution. And so people in traditionalistic political cultures adhere more to the private sector, and they want the private sector to take the lead more so than the government here. And again, these are more examples, when it comes to government activity, civil rights and civil liberties, religious groupings, who tends to be in these groups here, and the geographic area, like we mentioned, right? So so these, of course, are the areas that we tend to see these political cultures here. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I know we have a little bit more to go. I just wanted to also discuss a little bit of Texas and the political culture. So like we mentioned that Texas, of course, obviously is a rather conservative state, both economic and socially. And so when it comes to economics, do keep in mind that within conservatism, they tend to ascribe to the laissez-faire model of capitalism, which basically means hands off. It's French for hats off. So the idea is that when it comes to the economy, and we'll talk more about this, because there's another chapter that discusses liberalism, conservatism when we get to the political parties chapter. But we'll talk about it definitely right now, so that way it ties to what we're discussing here. That again, so for conservatives, they tend to not be in favor of hardly any government involvement with the economy. They feel that the economy should have as little government involvement as possible. The private sector takes the lead. The private sector makes the major decisions, and the government is not going to put forth too many regulations. Conservatives do not really like regulations because they feel that we should let the private business owners pretty much make the rules because they know best. An example I like to give is, so let's say you've got someone in Congress who wants to regulate some industries, but let's say they don't have any experience in that industry. So a logical argument would be like, okay, well, who should we trust with making the ultimate decision? Should it be someone in Washington that's never had this type of experience of managing a business, or should we allow for the business owners who do this for a living? Should we let them kind of take the lead? So that's the conservative argument when it comes to laissez-faire, the economy, right? And this also explains why the government's not going to get involved if like the stock market's having a bad day, because the economy is looked at as a living, breathing organism. It's going to have its good days and its bad days, and so if things get really, really out of control, like we saw when everything shut down when COVID first struck a couple of years ago, then yes, the government will get involved. But if it's just, if the Dow just goes down a couple of points, we'll watch it. We'll see if it's a trend, but it's nothing to be like concerned about, right? Until things tend to get, if the points drop more, or if it becomes a lot more, if the dropping, if the trend continues, then the government might look to do something. But if it's just one bad day, as long as it's not like a really, really bad day, then the government's not going to bat an eye at it. Social. When it comes to conservatives, they tend to highly regulate moral behavior. Conservatives, because of the influence of religion, especially when it comes to these evangelical groups like the Baptists and the Methodists, and then also these non-denominational groups with these mega churches, they tend to very much be in favor of regulating moral behavior, because they feel that it is their right as Christians, to spread the word, and also to try to help with, I guess you could kind of say, like, bring morality to the world, right? So that's why they tend to be against abortion. They tend to be against marriage equality. They also tend to be against, what's going on with the LGBTQ community, with the gender, affiliations and things like that, and the pronouns and all that stuff. They tend to not be in favor of all of that. Whereas liberalism is pretty much the opposite of both these, right? So for liberalism or progressivism, they do believe in regulation of the economy, because liberals will point out that throughout American history, we've had examples of, we just had Labor Day last week, right? So we've had examples of some of these companies engaging in union busting and not allowing for workers to form unions, and not allowing for them to engage in what's called collective bargaining as part of unions. So because corporations have had a history of neglecting and taking advantage of workers, liberals point out to this idea that, hey, we need to regulate the economy, because we've tried to allow for the to give a hands-off approach to government involvement within the economy and within the regulation of these businesses, but it hasn't worked, because the companies were getting away with this. That's why some of these progressives like Teddy Roosevelt and later his cousin FDR were very big on regulation, putting forth these regulations, like we saw, like with the the trust busting of Teddy Roosevelt, and then the New Deal policies, which included workplace safety regulations, Fair Labor Standards Act, and then eventually OSHA, to provide regulations for to allow for people to have weekends, overtime, and to be able to be paid overtime, and then also, of course, workplace safety issues. So the liberals are definitely in favor of government regulation of the economy. Social issues, again, they're the opposite of the conservatives. They oppose government interference. Liberals feel that as long as nobody's breaking the law, it's not really anybody's business. Okay, sorry, someone's here at the door. I don't know, I think they're delivering something. But when it comes to this idea of social issues, like I said, liberals feel that it's not the government's business to be getting involved in what people do in their personal lives. That's why they tend to be pro-choice when it comes to abortion. Not necessarily that they support abortion themselves personally, but it's not the government's business to be telling people what to do about that issue, right? That's something that's personal. That's something between a woman and her physician, which is ultimately what Roe versus Wade was about. So liberals tend to be in favor of being pro-choice. They also tend to be in favor of marriage equality, and some of these other. So again, it's very easy to distinguish between the two of them, because they basically are polar opposites, right? Conservatives do not want regulation of the economy, but they want regulation of the social sphere. And liberals are the opposite. They do want regulation of the economy, but they don't want regulation of the social sphere. So I know we're already running low here on time. Texas is business friendly. So there is a good video that I want you all to watch. It's called "How Powerful is Texas?" And the video does go over a lot of these different numbers and these statistics, right? So Texas, of course, was voted on CNBN in terms of the top state for business, right? And this is why a lot of these businesses are coming over to Texas because of the lack of regulations. I've got some good resources that discuss how some of these businesses, like Tesla, right? Tesla's a good example of how they originally were in California, but they've moved over to Austin. And then, of course, SpaceX is down here because Elon Musk is bringing his company over here because of the lower taxes and less regulations. However, though, that also does come with a price because as we can see here, look at some of these numbers, right? Texas ranked 39th state by Prosperity Now in terms of some of these numbers, right? When we look at Texas tends to be rather high with violent crime. I know that, the major cities, like I know Houston is, it's a pretty dangerous city, unfortunately. Like I'll never forget how last summer I was exercising at one of the parks, and then as soon as the sun started going down, everybody split. And I'm like, what? Like, is it really that dangerous? Nobody's here. Like, everyone is leaving. Like, as soon as the sun went down. So, I guess it's either they're pretty strict about enforcing that, or I guess people are scared. Like, I know, like here at the parks, I'm here like close to midnight. Like, and I don't feel, I don't feel at all. So I know it's already 3:45. So let's go ahead and kind of like wrap this some of it. I was just gonna say that I don't feel unsafe at all. But look at some of these numbers, right? So Texas tends to be rather high with crime, incarceration definitely up there. Percent of children living in poverty. Look at that. They're second. Overall well-being, not very good. Number one, fossil fuel emissions, which again is not good, right? Because it's dirtiest, right? Toxic releases, SAT scores at the bottom. Overall education is in the bottom third. Environmental rank, bottom, bottom ranking, and then economic well-being again is in the, like the bottom, almost the bottom fourth here. So but it is so again, this is meant for you all to see like that while Texas does have a lot going for it when it comes to businesses, right? And businesses definitely do want to come to Texas. Are those successes and is that the money that the businesses are making, is it trickling down to the workers, and is it also causing issues with environmental concerns? So these are just some things to think about. So again, last thing, of course, we'll talk about is the census. Changing demographics. I am going to put an article because just in the last couple of months, in July, we had news broke that that the Hispanics are now the largest demographic group in Texas. There are more Hispanics than white people in Texas, and they had been almost neck and neck. And it was not a surprise that we saw the Hispanic population grow past the white population. That was already being predicted to happen, but it's just, I guess it was predicted a little bit sooner than what they thought, right? But yes, so now officially, in terms of the census numbers that they've been studying and analyzing, Texas now, Hispanics are now the largest group in Texas, eclipsing white people. And Texas, of course, even before that, was a majority minority state, because if you combine Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians, that definitely equaled more than 50%. Eventually, Texas might even get to a point where they'll be majority Hispanic, where over 51% of the state population, could be Hispanic. I don't know if that'll happen in my lifetime, but maybe in yours. Maybe that's something that we'll see. But I think it probably will happen maybe even sooner than we think. The political relevance of population, so increasing minority populations trend toward increasing liberalism. So again, as more minority groups are coming over to Texas, this is why Texas has become a little bit more of a battleground state. Texas is still a red state, but it's not quite as red as it used to be, right? Instead of being bright red, like let's say Oklahoma, Texas is becoming more pinkish, I guess you could say. Now, will it take the step to becoming purple? That remains to be seen, because even though Texas has a large Hispanic population, a lot of those Hispanics don't vote, and not all of those Hispanics are liberal Democrats. Not all of them are Democrats. A lot of them are Republicans, and some of that Republicanism is spreading down here even to the Valley. I've been doing some research on that. But liberalism is increasing with these minority populations, as well as also people moving from some of these more liberal states. Like a lot of people coming from California, they're also bringing their political viewpoints with them. So do keep that in mind as people are moving from some of these blue states to Texas, that they're also bringing their political viewpoints with them. It's almost like, if let's say, I moved to Washington State, let's say I moved to Seattle, I'm not going to go become a Seahawks fan. I mean, I'll for sure I'll root for them, if they're playing anybody else, but for sure I'm still a Cowboys fan, because I grew up in Texas. That's the only reason why I like the Cowboys, because I grew up. If I was not from Texas, I would not like. So thankfully they won really big last night, but yeah. So again, that's just an example of how people bring their viewpoints with them, and then larger influence on the political process, of course, because of just the sheer number of them coming over, and then of course this last thing, of course, we'll talk about is these are the numbers from the recent presidential election. So Donald Trump was able to win by about 600,000 votes. But you look at this map and you might say to yourself, and this is the last thing we'll talk about today. You might look at this map and you might be like, hey, Texas is overwhelmingly red. Well, yes, if you look at the map, Texas, almost all the counties are red, but nobody lives out here. Now, thankfully, this past summer I was able to drive through here. Like I was able to drive from Dallas, go up to Lubbock, and all the way to Amarillo. But it's very desolate out here, right? Very few people live here. This is all ranch land. There's probably more cows out here than people. So while Republicans dominate in the rural areas, there's not that many people who live there, right? Democrats, they have majorities in the urban areas, right? Like the DFW area. Although Fort Worth and Tarrant counties, does tend to be a little bit more conservative. Same thing with Montgomery County. This is where the Woodlands and Conroe is, just north of Houston. But Rosenberg over here, Rosenberg County, I think it's Rosenberg County. No, it's yeah, that's like Missouri City. That so that tends to be more Democrat. And then over here along the I-35 corridor, this one is Comal County. This is New Braunfels, but other than that, you got Kyle, Buda, and then Austin, and then also Georgetown up here. Round Rock. This tends to be rather liberal. This is probably the most liberal part of the state. And then of course you've got San Antonio. El Paso also tends to be rather progressive. And then you got all of us down here in the south. But if you notice, Zapata County went Republican, and Stark County almost did as well. So again, we're starting to see some of those changes here. This area also tends to be rather battlegroundish. Kleberg, as well as Nueces County. So those tend to be, they're the Republicans are winning right now, but we'll see how that works. That one's kind of pretty evenly split. But with that being said, okay, let's go ahead and end for today. So I definitely wanted for us to stop here for today. Let me stop the share and let's go ahead and stop the recording. So I hope this was interesting for you all. Some of the demographics we looked at and some of the aspects of Texas political culture. So like I said, let me stop the record here button really quickly.